Dear guests, we are glad to welcome you at the fourth seminar of our series, Historians and the War, Rethinking the Future. I will start with a short technical announcement. Our seminar today lasts for 2 hours, and in the second part, we will have a question and answer section where questions from the audience can be discussed. Thank you, and now I would like to ask Natalia to say a few words about our seminar series.
Thank you, Lena, for initial introductions. Everybody, welcome to the fourth seminar in our series. Lena had mentioned that recordings will be published on the Commission's website as well. For those connecting from Canada or North America, check out the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies website. 120 days ago, on February 24th, the Russian Federation launched the war on sovereign Ukraine. And given the scope and repercussions of that brutal invasion, many of us historians, social scientists face the need and also professional responsibility to address and revisit the very foundations upon which history, global European history, and our understandings of it have been built. The Russian war in Ukraine forces us to rethink the 20th century empires, nation states, wars, regimes, remembrance of the wars, the World War II, for example, mass crimes. So looking forward, how should we understand our history from the vantage point of today? What will become of it tomorrow? Thinking of all these very important questions, international partners, all of us 5 as of now, have gathered together and set this important international seminar series. Our 5 partners are the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, the Department of Eastern European History at Munich University, the Ukrainian Catholic University, Ukraine-based scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. This is, as I said, our 4th seminar, and it is titled Ruscism, Is Russia Fascist? It is being held in English with simultaneous translation, and I think, Lena, you've mentioned how to access the translation via the button there. And I welcome our moderator, Dr. Kai Struve, Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg, to moderate this session. Kai, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to start with a short, also short introduction in the subject and the questions we will discuss today. When Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, Vladimir Putin justified this attack, among other things, with the claim that Ukraine was ruled by Nazis and that it needed to be denazified. In the following weeks of the war, this accusation became increasingly prominent in Russian media as a justification of the war. In fact, this accusation had a background already in an older Soviet enemy image of Ukrainian nationalism as basically fascist, and a very broad Soviet concept of fascism that in principle could be applied to all non-Soviet or anti-Soviet forces. And in Russia, this enemy image of Ukrainian fascism had been strongly revived and instrumentalized already in 2014 when Russia started the war in the Donbass. It seems that in this time also the term Ruscism that we have now in the title of our seminar appeared for the first time as a combination of the terms Russia and fascism. In Ukraine as a kind of ironic reversal of this Russian propagandistic accusations in order to highlight the fact that the real fascism existed in Russia and that the aggression originated from Russia and its imperial ambitions. But this term pointed also to the rather enthusiastic support that Putin's regime could at that time generate in Russian society with the occupation of Crimea. But also, in the following years, in international debates, in recent years, some scholars, among them, for example, Timothy Snyder, in his book, The Road to Unfreedom in 2018, suggested that Putin's regime was becoming increasingly fascist. But most scholars at that time seem to have rejected this view. And now the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February, its brutal occupation and apparent intention of destroying Ukrainian identity, including the mass murder of alleged enemies, arrests, filtration camps, and deportation of civilians and other crimes, have given new weight, I believe, and new credibility to descriptions of the Russian regime as fascists. In addition, increasing repressions in Russia itself, but also some symbolism of the new war that appeared in Russia have been referred to in the public and the media as additional evidence that Russia has become fascist. However, one thing is to call those whom you don't like, even if you have extremely good reasons for that, fascists. And another thing is the debate about the term and the concept of fascism in the social sciences and historical research, and how the current Russian realities relate to them. And I think that is the question we would like to discuss today. How strong are the arguments for calling Russia fascist? And if it is not fascist, how should we describe it instead? I'm happy that we were able to put together a panel with 4 excellent experts on different aspects of this subject. I would like to introduce now our panelists. Yes, Marlene Laruelle is our first speaker, is professor and the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs of George Washington University. She's a leading expert on contemporary Russia, especially nationalism and memory politics, and the author of several monographs and many other publications on this and related subjects on politics and society in Russia and in Central Asia. Oleksandr Zaitsev is a professor at the Institute of History at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He has published important studies on Ukrainian nationalism in the interwar period and contributed from this perspective to the question of how to understand and define the concept of fascism. Roger Griffin is professor of contemporary history at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. And his research on fascism and the definition of the concept that he developed since the mid-1990s are perhaps the most nationalism in the 1990s. And he has continued his interest in studies in right-wing extremism and fascism since then. So I think we have a very, very interesting panel here, and we will now start with some introductory statements of about 10 minutes from the panelists, and we'll have then perhaps a short discussion among the panelists, and we'll then continue with questions from the audience that can be you're inviting to write into the chat. Yes, our first speaker is Marlene Laruelle. Her last book of several books, a large number of publications and a large number of books she published, appeared in the last year, in 2021, with Cornell University Press under the title, Is Russia Fascist? I enjoyed reading this book very much because it analyzes the various levels, aspects, and the development of this debate very clearly. However, your answer in the book is that Russia is not fascist, but rather that is a kind of an illiberal regime, and that we should not exclude Russia from Europe by calling it fascist. Yes, will you keep to this conclusion also after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Please, Marlene, the floor's there.
Thank you so much for the invitation for this important discussion. let me begin. I will be answering your question. Let me begin by the elephant in the room, which is answering the question, is Russia fascist? Will of course depend on the definition of fascism we will be using, but it also depends on the location of that Russian fascism, where we are looking for it. Are we looking at Putin speeches? Are we looking at the government, the Russian government, the Russian state? Are we looking at the Russian society? Are we looking at Russia's military action and violent repression in Ukraine? How do we manage the parallel that we are very often doing now between Russia's military invasion of Ukraine and the Second World War? We also have a growing parallel between the potentially legally defined genocide happening now and the Holocaust. So there is a lot of, it's not only about fascism, but there is a lot of narratives and kind of historical parallel made between what is happening now and the Second World War. And I think that's also kind of complicating the debates we're having. I think the title of this seminar is very good because by bringing the Ruscisms into the discussion, it's immediately invite us to realize that if there is a Russian fascism, it's a culturally specific one. So the goal is not to try to look for kind of neo-Nazi that would be looking for Hitler as a model, but to look at something that would be more Russified in terms of its ideological production, and that would have an anti-fascist and anti-Nazi narrative. And that's, of course, the paradox of this Rashism. So my own analysis of the situation in which we are since February 24, I base myself more or less on Roger's definition. For me, fascism is an ideology of regeneration of the nation through war. And that's for me the key elements that is necessary to kind of qualify for fascism. And based on that definition, I consider that today, Russia is still, and I will kind of explain more in detail, Russia is still not fascist because it doesn't have this ideology of regeneration through war. The Russian authorities are hiding the war to their citizens. They are refusing to mobilize militarily. They are hiding their dead. So when Timothy Snyder is saying that there is a cult of the dead in today's Russia, I disagree. There is a cult of the Second World War soldier, but there is no necrophilia as would be needed in for the fascism qualification and this kind of regeneration of the nation through war. There is no totalitarian party or youth organization mobilizing citizens. There was more or less one big mass rally at Luzhinsky, where we know people were more or less forced to attend and then left as soon as they could. So for me, Russia doesn't qualify because it doesn't have this myth of the regeneration through war. And on the contrary, it's hiding the war, which for me kind of disqualified it immediately. That said, you have very strong intellectual fascist tradition in Russia, with really since Soviet time already, and of course in the 90s, big names that qualify for fascism and that are still very active now. And I think not only of course Alexander Dugin, but also Prilyepin. You have a strong paramilitary culture that could potentially become really a strong vigilante movement. I think we don't have it yet, or we won't. We will see if we will have it or not. So if this paramilitary movement were really becoming a kind of big vigilante movement, for me, it would be already a sign that is shifting toward fascism. And then inside the Russian political system itself, now I think we can clearly identify the party of war with some name like Patrushev and so on. That is pretty much fascist in the sense that is calling for or believing in the self-regeneration of the nation thanks to the war in Ukraine. And that is also clearly genocidal toward Ukraine. And here I think it's important to dissociate being fascist in the sense of believing in self-regeneration of the nation and being genocidal. I think the narrative that we have seen, for example, in these infamous articles published by RIA Novosti in March, calling more or less for the genocide of Ukrainian, both physical and cultural genocide, I would dissociate that fascism. You can be a genocidal regime without being a fascist one. And I would think, for example, at what China is doing with the Uyghur. So for me, my reading of this article of RIA Novosti was very much like, let's try to do with Ukrainian what China is doing with Uyghur. So I think this party of war that we have inside the Kremlin structure, both as the fascist theme of self-regeneration and the genocidal aspect. So for me, the regime is not fascist, but inside the regime, you have a group that is a branch that is pretty much fascist, and that is now in tension with other parts of the Russian political system that are not so radical. And of course, that is still in tension and in flux, and it could evolve. But I think saying that Russia is not fascist doesn't mean it's not dangerous, doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered responsible for what it's doing. And I think we can qualify the regime for, of course, authoritarian, potentially turning toward totalitarian, repressive, imperialist. But for me, without this self-regeneration aspect, it's not fascist. The Russian society itself, for me, is not fascist. It is not ideologically mobilized. By the way, if we look at surveys, and of course we have to take them with caution, we can see that the Russian population, by the state-produced narrative about Ukraine is instrumentalized by the West and NATO as an anti-Russian tool, and there is a genocide against ethnic Russian in the Donbass, but they don't believe in the destruction of the Ukrainian state and nation. And I think that's also an interesting element to bring in the discussion. That said, the Russian society is not fascist. For me, what it is in its relationship to Ukraine, it's very clearly colonial or imperial, and we can discuss if there is a difference, because it believes that other post-Soviet nations don't really exist and has a kind of clear disdain for their existence as a nation and a state. And it has a very high level acceptance of state violence. And here I think there is a huge memory work of the Soviet regime that hasn't been finished in Russia, and that will have one day or another, and clearly it won't happen now. There will be need for a process of desacralization of the Second World War, and it will be a very painful process for part of the Russian society, because the war has been sanctified, and they will have to be able one day or another to deconstruct that, as well as to deconstruct this kind of colonial view of their neighbors. So you see the nuances I'm trying to bring in, both the analysis of the regime and the analysis of the society, considering that the notion of fascism doesn't fit for only some groups, but doesn't fit for the whole picture. My last point that I think is really important to bring in the discussion is that what we are discussing intellectually has a policy impact. Right, and so when we say that Russia is fascist, it has a political goal also of otherizing Russia from Europe, of framing the war as the free world against totalitarianism, of framing ourselves as being on the right side of history, as hoping for a defeat of Russia similar to the defeat of Germany in 1945. And I think all the historical parallel made with, like, we need a Nuremberg trials from the Russian regimes are kind of showing the importance of the parallel. It's also saying that Russia is fascist is also legitimizing NATO expansion. I don't say we should be against that. I'm just saying it's important to realize that there are policy implications for what we are saying. And reversely, those saying that Russia is not fascist would tend to be calling for policy solution that would be kind of more moderate and more compromised, kind of hoping for finding some kind of diplomatic talk. I think it's important to realize that we don't speak in a kind of empty world, and so there is intellectual legitimacy that may be used for some policies, and that is part of our discussion. Maybe I will stop here and for these few opening remarks, and really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this important introductory statement. I think the argument is that there are tendencies towards fascism, but Russia does not, or the Russian regime does not fulfill all qualifications, all qualifications that the current prevalent definition of fascism usually requires. Yes, our next speaker now is Oleksandr Zaitsev. As I said, he has published important studies on the radical nationalism and fascism in the interwar period, and he has there proposed the term of Ruscism, derived from the Croatian Ustasha movement for a specific form of fascism in Eastern Europe in this period. Because the cases here, among them also Ukrainian cases, do not fit very well with existing definitions of fascism that had been developed mostly on Italian, German, or Western European cases. And this may suggest the question whether we need, in a similar way, also the clearer definition or the introduction of the term Ruscism in fascism studies as a new specific form of fascism. Yes, please, Oleksandr.
Дякую, Кай. Я хочу лише наголосити, що коли я запропонував термін «усташизм», я мав на увазі не специфічну форму східноєвропейського фашизму, а форму ультранаціоналізму недержавних націй, яка відмінна від фашизму, хоча демонструє деякі подібності. І таким чином справа не в терміні, можна говорити усташизм, можна придумати інший термін, можна просто говорити про сепаратистський ультранаціоналізм, а яка концепція за ним стоїть. І те саме з рашизмом. Тобто, якщо ми використовуємо термін рашизм, то питання можна поставити так. Чи є рашизм формою фашизму, чи при деяких подібностях до фашизму все ж таки це відмінне явище. І тут я би розрізнив два аспекти. Це аспект пропагандистський і аспект академічний. Зараз точиться війна. Війна завжди супроводжується пропагандою. І в цій пропаганді ототожнення сучасного російського режиму з фашизмом, на мій погляд, цілком виправдане. Тим паче, що тут не є якась пропагандистська брехня, сучасний російський режим і його політика справді демонструють цілу низку типологічних подібностей із фашизмом, а надто із німецьким націонал-соціалізмом і його зовнішньою політикою. І я сам написав кілька статей, які опубліковані в інтернеті, опубліковані в деяких виданнях, де я без жодних сумнівів вживав термін рашизм як форму, російську форму сучасного неофашизму. Однак, і це цілком виправдано, оскільки це дає, так би мовити, впізнаваний образ ворога, оскільки фашизм асоціюється з війною, з агресією, з винищенням цивільного населення, з територіальними загарбаннями, то в пропаганді в цій війні ототожнення сучасного російського режиму з фашизмом є цілком виправданим. Якщо ми говоримо про академічне вживання термінології, то тут питання складніше, безперечно. І я хотів би почати з того, що однозначної відповіді на головне питання нашого семінару, чи є сучасна Росія фашистською, не може бути. Тому що, як якось дотепно пояснив Роджер Грифін, фашизм не схожий на качку. Fascism is not like a duck. І справді, у випадку з фашизмом так званий качиний тест не працює. Приналежність тієї чи тієї водоплаваючої птиці до родини качиних встановлюється на підставі об'єктивних ознак. І серед зоологів існує повний консенсус щодо цих ознак. Інакше в соціальних науках такі терміни, як фашизм, або лібералізм, або консерватизм, або будь-яке інше загальне поняття, яке використовується для розуміння політики, суспільства чи історії, немає консенсусу серед суспільствознавців і не може бути консенсусу щодо цих понять. Вони визначаються довільно і їхнє значення може змінюватись. І тому Роджер Грифін справедливо пише, що не було і досі немає об'єктивного, остаточного методу, щоб вирішити, належить якесь конкретне явище до категорії фашизму, чи не належить. Це стосується і сучасного російського політичного режиму. Тому можливі різні його інтерпретації і як різновиду фашизму, і як нефашистського авторитарного режиму. Питання не в тому, яка з цих інтерпретацій правильна, а в тому, яка з них має більшу евристичну вартість, і оскільки йдеться про сучасний режим, розвиток якого ми можемо спостерігати, то питання полягає в тому, яка інтерпретація краще виконує прогностичну функцію. І я хочу нагадати, що прогнози тих, хто інтерпретував російський режим як фашистський, як, наприклад, Олександр Мотель чи Тімоті Снайдер, виявилися доволі точними. Вони прогнозували, що російський режим може прийти до територіальної експансії, може прийти до війни, і так і сталося. Тим часом, як прогнози тих, хто заперечував фашистський режим, фашистський характер російського режиму, виявилися хибними, і війна виявилася для них несподіванкою, яка тяжко піддається раціональному поясненню. Я, на жаль, не читав книжки Марлен Laruelle «Is Russia Fascist?», але читав її статтю «Accusing Russia of Fascism. Polemics around Russia's belonging to Europe». Як на мене, це дуже добра деконструкція аналогії між путінським режимом і фашизмом, і, зокрема, нацизмом. Але в кількох аспектах, як мені видається, авторка все-таки недооцінює фашистських аспектів російського режиму, особливо в тому, що стосується територіальної експансії і війни. Ну, наприклад, авторка пише, цитую, «Nothing in Russia's official position in strategic nuclear defense policy can be interpreted as promoting war as a solution to regenerate the state». Ну і сьогодні професорка Лорель теж повернулася до цієї тези. Як на мене, сучасна війна – це якраз і є приклад війни як засобу не просто регенерувати національну державу, а регенерувати імперію. І це є головною метою цієї війни. І тут не так важливо, чи російське керівництво називає цю війну війною, чи спеціальною воєнною операцією. Для російського населення не є секретом, що це є війна, щоб там не говорили на горі. Просто я хочу нагадати, що російський кримінальний кодекс передбачає до 10 років в'язниці за розв'язування і ведення війни. І, очевидно, Путін не хоче на підставі того, що він визнає цю війну війною, давати привід для суду упекти його у в'язницю на 10 років. Тим не менше, ні для кого не секрет, що це є війна. Професорка Лорель говорить, що акції Росії проти Грузії в 2008 році, проти Україною в 2014 році були реакцією на те, що Росія інтерпретувала як дії Заходу, спрямовані проти Росії. І що насправді у російського керівництва немає справжньої підтримки ірредентистських рухів на території колишніх республік Радянського Союзу в сенсі зміни кордонів, і що це відсутнє в офіційній політиці. Ще одна цитата, яку я хочу прокоментувати. Цитую. Crimea is the only example of concrete irredentism. A so far unique case that can be explained as the Kremlin reaction to its loss of influence over Ukraine and its fear of losing access to Sevastopol, its main gate to the Black Sea. Here too, Moscow's actions were reactive. The Kremlin intervened once it understood that it could not stop the Euromaidan revolution and Ukraine's subsequent geopolitical reorientation. Without the Euromaidan, Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. Я сподіваюся, що авторка не хотіла цим сказати, що українці самі винні, що втратили Крим, тому що цю цитату можна зрозуміти і в такий спосіб. Гаразд, допустимо, що анексія Криму була реакцією на Євромайдан. Але на що було реакцією? Вторгнення в Україну в лютому цього року. В Україні не було нової революції. Не було ескалації на Донбасі. Україна була так само далекою від НАТО, як і в 2014 році. Жодних агресивних дій з боку України стосовно ні Донбасу, ні Криму, ні Росії не було. Тому я думаю, що в даному випадку це не була ніяка реакція. Це була реалізація плану відновлення імперії, який, як я припускаю, Путін розуміє як свою історичну місію. Якщо це й була реакція, то це була реакція на сам факт існування самостійної України, яка самостійно визначає свою внутрішню і зовнішню політику і самостійно визначає свою геополітичну орієнтацію. І саме це не влаштовує російське керівництво, а не ті чи інші конкретні дії чи то України, чи то Заходу. І повертаючись до рашизму. Так, я гадаю, що ми потребуємо якогось спеціального терміну для визначення того, що відбувається сьогодні і у внутрішній, і у зовнішній політиці Росії. Чи є рашизм формою фашизму? При всіх подібностях сучасної російської політики до фашизму, а їх можна називати і більше, я все ж таки бачу одну і дуже суттєву відмінність, і тут я згідний з тим, що написала професорка Лорель, і з тим, що раніше писав Роджер Гріфін і Андреас Умланд. Фашизм – це рух в суті своїй революційний. Він прагне не лише до революційної трансформації власного суспільства, не лише до революційної трансформації світового порядку, а до антропологічної революції, створення нової фашистської людини. Нічого подібного ми не спостерігаємо в сучасній путінській політиці. Це є політика не революції, це політика радше ультраконсервативна, спрямована на збереження існуючого стану речей і на відновлення того, що було в минулому, а не на створення чогось нового. І це в корені відрізняє сучасний російський режим від фашизму. Чи є він в цьому випадку чимось кращим чи гуманніший? Аж ніяк ні. Аж ніяк ні. Це агресивний режим. І я би, якщо погодитись із вживанням терміну рашизм, я би інтерпретував рашизм як сучасну форму російського імперського націоналізму. Російський імперський націоналізм історично народився в 19 столітті. Він спирається на кілька стовпів. Це імперіалізм, самодержавство або автократія, ворожість до Заходу, месіанізм і українофобія. Чому я виділяю саме українофобію із всіх можливих етнічних фобій? Та тому, що саме Україна була для російського імперіалізму завжди найважливішою. Російський імперський націоналізм ще міг змиритися з утратою Польщі, як частиною Російської імперії, але ніколи не мислив Російську імперію без України. Тому українофобія була і залишається по сьогоднішній день однією з найважливіших складових російського імперського націоналізму. А рашизм, як сучасна форма цього російського імперського націоналізму, відрізняється, я б сказав, двома обставинами. Це прагнення до відновлення імперії, втраченої в 1991 році. І друге – це використання деяких методів, притаманних фашизму для досягнення цієї мети. І я повертаюся до того, про що писала професорка Лорель, яка говорила про те, що дискусія про те, чи є Росія фашистською чи ні, насправді є дискусією, чи Росія має бути включена в Європу, чи вона має бути виключена з Європи. Я цитую. If Russia is fascist, if the Putin regime can be typologized as fascist, or if the Soviet past that the Kremlin does not want to denounce is the equivalent of Nazism, then Russia is to be excluded from Europe and portrayed as an antithesis, the constituent other of all the values embedded in the notion of Europe: liberalism, democracy, multilateralism, transatlantic commitment. Так, саме так. І я вважаю, що сучасна Росія, Росія путінського режиму, справді мусить бути виключена з Європи. Не тому, що вона фашист. Це справді спірне питання. А тому, що вона розв'язала агресивну війну, яка вже коштувала десятків тисяч життів і українців, і росіян. І ця політика Росії є абсолютно несумісна з тим, що ми називаємо європейськими цінностями. І, так би мовити, повернення Росії, можливе повернення Росії до Європи, можливо, не при путінському режимі, можливо, не шляхом якихось дипломатичних заходів, компромісів, а лише після повного усунення путінського режиму. І я хочу нагадати, що всі великі революції і реформи в Росії починалися після програних війн. І тому саме поразка Росії в цій війні може дати шанс російській демократії. Дякую.
Yes, thank you very much for this explanation. So the thesis is that Russia does not fulfill the criteria for fascism, but we need the term of Ruscism, and yes, it's the conclusions we have to draw are rather similar that should draw if we would come to the conclusion that Russia is fascist. That's what I conclude from your talk. But now our next speaker is Roger Griffin. Your name has already mentioned by the two speakers before, and we are very curious now to hear what you have to say on this subject.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must make my credentials clear. I'm not a Russianist. Unfortunately, I cannot speak Russian. I am not an expert on Eastern European history. So I come to this debate as an outsider to the core, the empirical core of the argument. But I presume my presence is because I have worked a long time on trying to refine a definition which is useful. And I must stress that there are, I think Oleksandr was talking about my reference to a duck. In one of my books, I said that in the natural sciences, and that includes, of course, life sciences, you can arrive at a relatively consensual definition of a natural phenomenon. So you can actually define a species and whether a bird belongs to that species. There are some very interesting borderline cases, but generally speaking, taxonomy works. It is very clear, and we could spend a lifetime on the reasons for this, that in the human sciences, the relationship between terminology and taxonomy and the real world is extremely complicated, both in the way the brain works and the relationship between language and the external world. And especially when it comes to ideologies, it is impossible to have a consensual, objective definition of anything. And if you want references back, you can go and read your Max Weber. Now, so can we go back to basics and say that there is no objective answer to whether Putin's Russia or Putin's policies or ideology, if he has an ideology, can be seen as fascist. The only point of attempting to apply the term is whether we see more objectively, empirically, about what's going on. And that really does depend which definition of fascism you use. Now, mine is only one, and I must keep pointing out that there is a very healthy school of Marxist studies of fascism, which would approach this whole issue very differently. What I would say is that if my own approach is adopted and it has been influential, but it is by no means, thank goodness. I mean, fascist studies is not a totalitarian propaganda machine like in some parts of the world. It's there is no need for anybody to adopt the term unless they find it useful. Tim Snyder last week obviously doesn't find it useful, either from his book writing in books or from his magazine articles or newspaper articles. At one point, though, he does say in the most recent article he wrote in the American press that there is no consensual definition of fascism. Well, that is objectively untrue. There is a very thriving school of comparative fascist studies, which has grown up since the 1990s, where there's a community of people who do use it to refer to a revolutionary form of ultranationalism. Now, that revolutionary form, and both Oleksandr and Marlene have alluded to this, that implies more than just regenerating the country, making it great again in a Trumpian sense, and making people feel good about where they're living. If you actually look at the original fascist regime in Italy, it didn't want just to make Italy feel good after the First World War. It wanted a new Italy. It actually wanted to destroy the apparatus of liberal democracy and create a new type of Italy based on ultranationalism, based on the Roman myth, with an empire, with a new type of economy, etc., etc. It did bring in the Catholic Church, and that is reminiscent of Putin's relationship with Orthodoxy. But it wasn't just an attempt to make the country feel good about itself. So I do think it's quite important, if we're going to bother about the way academics use the term, especially the type of approach that I embody, that we see whether Putin has shown any signs of actually wanting to destroy the Russian constitution and create a new order based on a different constitutional process, and wanting to actually create a new type of Russian citizen. And I think that there we could spend quite a lot of time on this. What I would say in order to short circuit my own introduction is this: I regard a word like fascism as a sort of conceptual lens through which to look. Every different term you use makes you see different things. We can see certain elements of fascism in certain aspects of Putin's politics. But what worries me is that a lot of people are using the word fascism about Russia when they really mean the Third Reich. Now, Nazism was a very particular form of fascism. If we look at the Falange in Spain, or even Britain's BUF, or the Brazilian Ação Brasiliana, Integralista Brasiliana, they were fascist, but they had no great imperialistic or eugenic or even deep anti-Semitic impulses. They would not have led to Auschwitz or the sort of slave states that we associate with Nazis. So I think it's very important that we don't let the word fascism somehow slide through slippage into the application of the term Nazi, which of course is deeply ironic in the case of Putinism because of the way he misuses the term. What I would like to suggest really is that the Putin regime and Putin's own worldview is I regard it as a sort of culinary curry made up of different ingredients which are sort of stirred together over the heat of an obsession with making Russia great again, or rather avenging Russia for the catastrophe that can be seen as being imposed on Russia after 1990, very much in the way that the ultranationalists in Weimar saw the Weimar constitution as imposed on Germany, as not being really German, and there was a deep nostalgia for Germany to avenge itself for the loss in the First World War and make itself great again. So let's just proliferate some of the terms. You can see it through the lens of fascism. You can see it through the lens of Nazism, Russian imperialism, Soviet imperialism, various forms of totalitarian imperialism, including, of course, Bolshevism, but also Japan. If you look at the imperial ambitions of interwar Japan and the occupation of Korea and parts of China, etc., you can see again something about modern imperialism which has an echo. You can see it also in a tradition historically of despotism or personal dictatorship. And there I think it's very important for experts much cleverer than me to talk about how far Putin has succeeded, like Hitler, in creating a genuine state based on an internalization of an ideology. I mean, Nazism was not just about Hitlerism. He succeeded in surrounding himself with Hitlerites who pumped out ideology and created an entire state apparatus of propaganda, terror, and also education and mass organizations to diffuse this worldview throughout the society to create a legacy after Hitler had died. It was going to be a 1,000-year Reich. I see no equivalent attempt to diffuse a Putinism in the pursuit of a new order. When I gave a talk for Anton Shekhtetsov's Democratic Forum, I stressed the idea of Putin as being driven by what I called, after Nietzsche, resentment politics, the mentality of a bully who deeply resents the sense of Russia's impoverishment and marginalization since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and therefore was pursuing what I called a Project Mayhem, to actually pursue a whole set of policies which undermined the stability of the West. I mean, in other words, his support for Trump, if we can assume there was a support for Trump, was not because he wanted Trumpism to conquer the world, but he knew it would mess up American democracy. And there are a whole lot of other issues. I would similarly say his involvement in the Middle East is motivated by far more by the sort of attempt to disturb the international order than actually to have some sort of Middle Eastern empire. So I think that you can have a look at what's going on in Russia and in Putin's mind through various lenses. And I would actually therefore propose methodological pluralism on one hand, if we want to get close to what's going on. But the real question I would like to ask is, what is the point of trying to put Putin and Putinism in a box called fascist? I am very impressed by a series of programs on the BBC in the last few months, where journalists, Putin watchers, claimed to have spotted a deep change in Russian foreign policy, or Putin's foreign policy, ever since the economic crisis of 2007. They tracked through the growing distancing from the idea of being integrated into Western economics and politics. And they actually saw the Crimean occupation as coming out of a change of policy which had not really been picked up by a lot of politicians and academic experts, but a lot of very good journalists had already seen this coming. I would make a parallel with the way the West misunderstood Hitler because they didn't study Mein Kampf, and there was this fallacy that he could somehow be stopped because there were natural limits to his imperial ambition in Czechoslovakia and in Austria. I think it's very clear that nothing stopped in 2014. And I would like to suggest that it doesn't really matter what ism we attach Putin to. The most important ism is probably Putinism. And that isn't a static thing. He has actually developed and changed over time. And now he is in a state of mind familiar from the study of all autocracies. His reality principle is extremely limited. He's surrounded himself by yes men and people who, for one reason or other, support his policies, but he's actually mentally isolated from reality in many respects. This is something that happened to Mussolini and Lenin and Hitler, obviously, etc., etc. And that really, rather than get bogged down in academic debates about which ism we use, we really do need to have a closer look at Putinism. And I would please warn people from my confusing Putinism with Russia and Russianism. There will be a post-Putin epoch. I'm disturbed by the fact that some people in chat are talking about the Russians and Russian society. I don't believe there's any such thing. I think Russian society is extremely complex. And just as it would be a fallacy to think of all Germans in the Third Reich as Nazis, I think it's a terrible fallacy to assume that Russians are all Putinists and somehow colluding with the war. And I'm looking forward to the Democrats and humanists within Russia after Putin, however far in advance in the future, I don't know, who are then brought back at least into the international community without stressing that they should be integrated into Europe. And finally, the probably most valuable academicism we can look at modern Russia through is Eurasianism, a complicated relationship between Easternness and Westernness, which you don't have any equivalent of in European fascism. So that's my rather confusing and confused answer to the basic question. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting observations, I believe, on different aspects of our subjects, on the complexities of the debates and definitions of fascism, on alternative terminologies as imperialism we can apply to understand to the current Russian situation and politics, and also to the introduction of the term, the well-established, but the introduction of the term Putinism in our debate. That is, I think, also important. Yes, and our last speaker now is Andreas Umland, with a difficult task to come to a conclusion of all the different points. And please, Andreas, we are very curious what you have to say on this subject.
I'm not sure I'm either qualified or authorized to conclude here anything. I'd rather present my own ideas. In fact, our debate is, of course, a continuation of all the debates that Marlene and myself and Leonid Lux had with Alexander Motyl in different outlets and conferences in different languages. In fact, there was a debate in the German journal Osteuropa about Motyl's proposal about 10 years ago that Russia is fascist or quasi-fascist. And this is now a continuation, and I would basically agree with what Marlene said and Roger, and again just repeat what was already mentioned in this older discussion, that there is no revolutionary ideology in Russia, that basically Putin is happy actually with the current Russian Federation as a continuation of the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire, that needs to be expanded and needs to better replicate the Tsarist and the Soviet empires, but that is basically okay and does not need a palingenesis as such. The misunderstandings here about the terminology of fascism, and I leave perhaps Snyder out here and focus again on Motyl, is, and I think on many observers, that most of the comments that one hears about Russia as a fascist, actually focus on the regime. And I'm here a follower of Roger Griffin in seeing fascism primarily as an ideology. For instance, in Motyl's definition of fascism, paradoxically, the Italian fascist regime would not be fascist because he defines it as a personalistic, as an authoritarian regime with a personalistic dictator. And as we know, Mussolini has been deposed by the king of Italy, and then who changed then the regime and put in a non-fascist government. And so this discussion about the regime as being fascist is, I think, somewhat useless, because it does not allow us actually to speak of fascist ideas, of fascist movements, because we could only use the term once there is a regime. And Motyl then has a fairly broad definition of fascism that leads him then to assert, and I'm reading here out of his article in Communist and Post-Communist Studies, that Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, Assad's Syria, Amin's Uganda, Duvalier's Haiti, and Atatürk's Turkey are all fascist, because they sort of fulfill his definition of a fascist regime. And I would still stick to that, But I think we have since 2021 here a new phenomenon, and these are the new texts that the Russian regime has been issuing, either Putin himself or other speakers of the Russian regime about Ukraine. And here I think there is indeed, during the last year, there has appeared something new that I would argue perhaps allows the application of a modified sort of subspecies of fascism that I would preliminarily here call compartmentalized fascism, in that we have here the idea of a cleansing of a newborn territory, which, however, is not Russia as the Russian Federation, but is Ukraine. And the important thing here about Ukraine is that Ukraine is understood by the speakers of the Russian regime, whether they are ideologists or politicians, not as an independent country, but as being actually part of Russia. And here I also follow basically Griffin's methodology, in that I think that we should be analyzing what these actors say, not in terms of how we objectively qualify and classify the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but in terms of how these actors, Putin and Zaitsev and Medvedev and so on, how they see the conflict, how they see Ukraine, how they see the special operation. So objectively, we may be arguing that what we have here is a typical case of colonialism, imperialism, a colonial territory, an imperial nation, and the imperial nation is basically trying to get back the old colony. However, that is, I think, not how people in Moscow see. They see actually the territory of Ukraine as belonging to the core of Russia, and as not being something outside Russia, but as something that is inside the Russian world. And so I think actually that this objectively perhaps good approach to describe this conflict in imperialist colonialist terms is correct, but I'm not sure it really reflects the ideology of Russia towards Ukraine and the conceptualization of Ukraine by those who have initiated this so-called special operation. A second approach that has recently been developed for this Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the well-known concept of the narcissism of the small differences, brilliantly outlined by Oleksandr Zaitsev in an article for the Journal of Genocide Research, which then refers to an old sort of theoretical concept that has been used in the analysis of the Yugoslav wars by Mikhail Ignatiev, by the Azeri-Armenian war by Tom de Waal, and that goes back, of course, to Sigmund Freud and to an anthropologist called Edward Crowley. And this whole literature is very well presented in a review article, by the way, by Paul Kolstow, a Norwegian Russianist who has sort of analyzed the different uses of this narcissism of small differences. And here, too, I would say that although Atkins' recent paper in the Journal of Genocide Research is brilliant, and I can only recommend it, it's especially good on the issue of genocide in Ukraine, I would again argue that this is not exactly how the Russian leadership sees it, because the Russian leadership does not see the Ukrainians, the small Russians, and the great Russians as being somehow distinct in the same way with small differences as the Azeris and the Armenians are different from each other, or as the Serbs and the Croats are different from each other, but rather they see the Ukrainians as a part of the Russian nation. And this Russian nation has been infected by foreign ideas, by liberalism, by Nazism, by Westernism, by Americanism, you name it, by Europeanism, and so on. And it needs to be cleansed. And therefore, the war against Ukraine is not only for legal reasons called a special operation, but also for political reasons, I would say, because of course Russia cannot conduct a war against itself. It needs to conduct a special operation to cleanse this particular part of Russia and to create a newborn Russia in this part of Russia that has been lost and infected with these foreign ideas, and that needs to be born anew with this cleansing operation. That is, I think, how the Russian leadership sees it. This is not maybe how Ukrainians see that. They see themselves as a distinct nation with their own language and so on, and with their own culture, history, and so on. But in the minds of the Russian leadership and of people like Zaitsev and Putin and so on, this territory belongs to Russia. And you have the monument of Volodymyr in Moscow, although Volodymyr was never in Moscow. So you could mention here a lot of different things to illustrate that. And so some of these, if you watch the news about the war, the people who are killed or who are attacked are always the Natsbate, the nationalists, the Nazis, the fascists. They are killed, they are cleansed, they are drawn away. But the good Ukrainians will be re-educated, they will be deported, they will be reunified with a historical motherland. This is the purpose of this special operation. That, of course, is not a war, because you cannot conduct, as I said, a war against yourself. And here I think one could perhaps apply the term of fascism, because what the Russian leadership here wants to do is not to reconquer an old colony, but it needs to cleanse, to recreate anew to this particular part of the Russian world. And of course, here also the political conclusions, the policy conclusions that I would make from this interpretation are rather different from Marlene's. I think the fanatic view of the Russian leadership of Ukraine, when Medvedev, now even somebody like Medvedev, who was once regarded as a liberal, describes the Ukraine as scum and as bastards, and that even if we have this sort of I would say fascist ideology basically here behind this operation in Ukraine, then I don't think negotiations and some sort of accommodation, some sort of negotiated solution is actually in there. They want to actually destroy the existing Ukrainian state. They want to reunify it with historical Russia, to bring it back to its historical origins. It's also not a continuation of the past, because the past has been thoroughly infected with Ukrainian nationalism, with Western ideas, with European ideas. So it's rather the return to a golden age, to the old Rus, so to say, when everybody was in this community of great Russians, small Russians, and Belarusians. And so this is actually something that actually makes me think about applying here the term of fascism. I have not yet formulated this in written form. It's all very new. For instance, the quote from Medvedev is very recent, and I'm afraid we will be getting more of these texts, like Zaitsev texts, and perhaps from Putin also new texts that will be going in the same direction. And I think what can be done here is to defend Ukraine from this sort of ideology is only to arm it as much as possible, because this Ukrainian state is going to be destroyed, because it needs to be reborn. It needs to be born anew, to be brought back to its larger Great Russian, or I don't know how you would call it, Greater Russia origins, where it actually comes from and was separated from the Russian national body by this infection with Western ideas, whether Nazi or liberal or LGBT, and also that one could even argue that there is a certain because the term Ukrainophobia was mentioned here, that there is a certain tolerance also towards Ukrainian culture as a sort of local Russian culture, sort of like the Bavarian culture within Russia. So we had, for instance, the Patriarch Kirill apparently learning some Ukrainian and actually coming to Kiev and speaking Ukrainian to his comrades from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy. So this sort of Ukrainian culture is seen as a part of a greater Russian culture. It has been infected. It needs to be cleansed. It needs to be born anew, and then it will find a return to its true origins as part of this Eastern Slavic community of Russians, small Russians, and Belarusians.
Yes, thank you very much. That was now an argument for considering the current Russian state regime, in fact, as fascist, increasingly fascist, and that poses a severe, serious threat for Ukrainians before the background of this intention of not recognizing a clear separate Ukrainian identity. And the argument also there is that the analytical tools or concepts of imperialism or colonialism are not sufficient for understanding what is Russia intending or planning in Ukraine. Yes, thank you very much for all these interesting and important comments. I think there was a lot of I think there were some questions and points raised by the different speakers that relate also to other statements we had here. So Oleksandr Zaitsev clearly referred to publications of Marlene, so I think we should start with you to react to this discussion or criticism that appeared then.
Was a great discussion. Yeah, Oleksandr, to go back on your arguments that are really important on the territorial expansion aspect. For me, what matters is that the Russian regime is not static. Has been evolving a lot. And I think this invasion was not written in the DNA of the regime or of Putin over the years. It's arrived to that result, but there was many other futures that were possible. So I think one of the danger of the narrative about Russia is fascist is that it has a kind of retroactive aspect of making us think that everything was kind of tautologically, retrospectively already there. And I think that's not the point, because that makes us lose the kind of the historical contingency, right? All that kind of crisis accumulated over 30 years with Ukraine and between the West and Russia over Ukraine has been building up. And I think all that was not written. It happened now, but because of a succession of different failure. And so for me, in terms of the territorial expansion, what has been going on is that Russia has been evolving on the way it sees how it wants to use territory. For very long, it wanted to control territory that were outside the federation as a way to weaken political opponents, so Moldova, Georgia, mostly, and then use that as a bargain. And then gradually territory began to have a meaning in itself, right? To have value in itself. And I think that was first Crimea, and of course, now the invasion, where suddenly it seemed that space in itself, like conquering space for the need of conquering space, matter, not so much for bargaining, but just for having it. I think we have also something growing that is linked to this will of having more space, which is the will of having more people. There is a demographical aspect, I think, of the conquest, is that having more potential citizen. And I think all the kind of filtration camp that we see, the fact that many Ukrainians, including Ukrainian children, are sent to Russia, there is a need for population. And I will finalize what I wanted to say, and linking that to your point that February 24 was a reaction to nothing, because nothing happened on the Ukrainian side. I agree, of course, nothing happened on the Ukrainian side. And when the revolution, the Maidan revolution happened, it shouldn't have created that reaction of Russia. But I think seen from the Russian side, it's not nothing that happened. The Russian interpretation, and that was very visible since like 2021, right, that the windows of opportunity for Russia to keep control of Ukraine was decreasing. Minsk agreements were failing. There was more and more laws that Russia was interpreting as anti-Russian laws. There was growing bilateral military assistance from UK, Canada, US to Ukrainian army. So I think there was this feeling in Russia that even if Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO, it is gradually integrated and improving the quality of its army, and therefore it was the time to do it. And then, as Roger said, I think there are a lot of elements we need to enter into the picture, which is, and we know that with COVID, Putin has been very isolated, even physically, and then things have been kind of evolving probably also in his mind. And so what I want to say that, and I will stop here, that for me, the conquest of territory, the way Russia is doing it now, it's a reaction to its own failure at keeping Ukraine under other means. For very long, Russia wanted to control Ukraine in a softer way, right? By politics, by energy, by kind of cultural pressure. And when that failed, then the only solution was the conquest. And that's interesting because it means that Putin went from a model that was a Soviet model for Eastern Bloc, like the Soviet Union had with Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War period, like you have a friendly regime in place as part of your buffer zone. That failed for Ukraine, but that was what Putin wanted. And once this kind of Soviet model of the socialist bloc failed, then it's back to the empire in a very 19th century sense. And I think the recent Putin speech about comparing himself to Peter the Great is an interesting kind of shift of Putin from Soviet references to Tsarist references. So I think this territorial expansion aspect, it's a pretty recent one, the way it has been formulated. I think we see it still evolving, the way Russia is building its playbook for occupied territory now, the way they are trying to annex Kherson or have it. So we can see it's not the traditional playbook for frozen conflict. It's something that is between the Donetsk model and the Crimea model. They are still testing the way they can manage this territorial expansion. So for me, it's something evolving. And when we use the fascism definition, we lose not only the methodological pluralism Roger was mentioning, but also this kind of the fact that it's not static, that it's still fluid, that it's a regime that is testing different products to see which one works, and that kind of try to stick to the one that seems to be working on the, at least on the short term. And I mean, there was many other great elements of the discussion, but I will stop here so far.
Yes, thank you very much for pointing to this aspect. Yes, I would like to pass over to Oleksandr. Would you like to comment on something that we had in the...
Так, дякую. Я все ж таки вважаю, що ті дії путінського режиму, особливо в зовнішній політиці, не можна зводити лише до реакцій, до ситуативних реакцій на певні дії Заходу чи Сходу. Я припускаю, що Путін від самого початку мав цю ідею реставрації імперії. І на це вказують багато його висловлень і багато його дій. І врешті-решт в цьому році він дійшов висновку, що пора нарешті це здійснити. І тут є певні аналогії з Гітлером. Біографи Гітлера пишуть, що він дуже хотів розпочати вирішальну війну до того часу, як йому виповниться 50, поки він ще молодий і енергійний. Можливо, Путін має щось подібне на увазі. Поки він ще недостатньо старий, поки він ще при владі, він вирішив, що пора реалізувати ту історичну місію, яка на нього покладена – відродження імперії або з Радянського Союзу в новій формі. Кажуть часом, що відсутній етнічний націоналізм в ідеології путінського режиму. Він присутній. І Андреас нагадав про те, що Путін вважає, що росіяни, українці і білоруси – це фактично один народ. такий спосіб він розглядає цю проблему в етнічних категоріях. І висновок із цього, що росіяни, українці і білоруси мають належати до однієї нації, оскільки колись вони становили один етнос. Такий висновок Путін. Що це, як не елементи етнічного націоналізму? Причому цілком правильно вказує Андреас, що українці, і особливо українці, але також і білоруси в цій схемі виглядають як якісь зіпсовані росіяни. Росіяни зіпсовані багатолітнім пануванням Польщі і Литви, росіяни зіпсовані західними впливами. Отже, треба їх очистити від цих шкідливих західних впливів і повернути їх до російського лона. Це є етнічний націоналізм в його найгіршій формі. Але я наполягаю на тому, що ми радше маємо говорити про російський імперський націоналізм, який не є чисто етнічний, який не є чисто громадянський. Імперський націоналізм – це форма націоналізму, центральною ідеєю якого є створення, підтримання або відновлення імперії з панівною нацією у цій імперії. І цією панівною нацією мають бути росіяни. Причому росіяни мисляться у подвійному сенсі. І як етнічні росіяни, і як росіяни-громадяни цієї імперії. Я нагадую, що в російській мові є два терміни, які ми звично перекладаємо як росіяни або як russians. Це русські, росіяни в етнічному сенсі, і росіяни. Це громадяни Росії. Але в кожному разі російська нація мислиться як панівна в цій імперії, яку належить відродити. Ну і що стосовно геноцидних аспектів, справді в риториці Путіна ці геноцидні аспекти відсутні або майже відсутні. Але тут уже згадувалася стаття Тимофія Сергійцева, висловлювання Медведєва, інші статті, які публікувалися на сайті РІА Новості. І справді ця українофобія, про яку я говорив, а я маю на увазі насамперед політичну українофобію, тобто абсолютне несприйняття існування України поза Росією, поза Російською імперією, як самостійної держави. Так от у цих статтях українофобія дійсно досягає вже геноцидного рівня, заперечення просто права української нації на існування і ліквідація цієї української загрози навіть шляхом фізичного винищення великих частин українського населення, навіть шляхом заборони самого вживання імені Україна. І тут би я погодився з Марлен Лорель, яка говорить, що існує ось така фашистська група в російському керівництві. І якщо я справді маю певні сумніви, що сучасний російський режим можна називати фашистським, саме через те, що він, на мій погляд, все ж таки не показує справжньої революційності, справді революційних намірів. То певні групи всередині цього режиму, а також поза ним, які існують у Росії, і які російський політичний режим толерує, можуть бути кваліфіковані як фашистські або неофашистські. Тобто, мій загальний висновок полягає в тому, що сучасний російський режим, ба навіть сучасне російське суспільство, демонструє набагато більше подібностей із фашизмом, ніж багато дослідників готові були визнати досі. Тим не менше, я вважаю, що, я повертаюся до цієї теми, якщо ми використовуємо термін «рашизм», то рашизм – це радше сучасна форма давнього історичного російського імперського націоналізму, яка має різні обличчя. Ми можемо говорити про путінізм, ми можемо говорити про певні течії рашизму всередині режиму, поза режимом, але це сучасна, агресивна, екстремістська форма російського імперського націоналізму. І поки ця форма існує, поки вона має владу і поки вона веде агресивну війну, я тут не бачу можливостей для компромісу, для якихось дипломатичних переговорів. Політика Європи, політика Заходу, політика людства по відношенню до такого режиму, який веде такою політикою, має бути безкомпромісною, і рашизм повинен бути зруйнований. Дякую.
Yes, thank you very much for this additional statements. Yes, our next, my question is to Roger Griffin, if you would like to comment on something.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it short because I think we're excluding a lot of our. Sorry, I'm hearing Ukrainian there. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the points. Just to repeat a couple of points. As I've said, fascism, I think, is so complex, refers to so many different types of regime. In fact, for me, it only refers to 3 regimes: Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Ustasha. Fascists in the interwar period, there were collaborationist movements which got involved as puppet states with the Third Reich, Arrow Cross, Quisling, etc. But the relationship between fascist movements and power is very complicated, and they produce different patterns. There are deep differences between Ustasha and Nazi Germany. There were much greater differences between Nazi Germany and Italian fascism. And if you project forward from fascist movements such as Quisling's Nationalsammlung or the Romanian Iron Guard, you get very different futures. So there is no stable, even when you've agreed a sort of definition, you cannot talk generically about a fascist regime or a fascist state or a fascist mentality. It's a family of different, a loose family with some extremely psychotic, destructive individuals at one end and some relatively benign, non-nihilistic, non-genocidal members as well. So I'm very worried about the word fascism. It's not precise. And I would like to point out a very good book that's come out recently by the American Jeffrey Bale and his colleague Tamir Baron, called Fighting the Last War. And he basically implies that we were so, as a civilization, traumatized by the horrific events of the Second World War, and especially the Third Reich and the genocide and the campaign in Russia, that it is, we use the word fascism as a sort of conditioned reflex whenever we encounter a form of destructive authoritarianism, totalitarianism, or basically any form of dogmatism we don't like. And it basically is an othering adjective. It has very little political content, or because it's been so contaminated by its pejorative and othering use. So I'd like to get away from that word and just argue again that we should have a whole, like a toolkit of different concepts we use delicately to try and get closer to what it is. I've already listed some of those. The reason I don't like any reference to Ruscism is that it essentializes Russia. There is no Russia in a single monolithic sense. And I think one of the dangers is to confuse this phase of Putin's politics with somehow something much more generic and part of, I mean, I grew up in a society that had demonized the Germans as essentially warlike, and they then went on to become some of the most liberal democratic citizens of modern Europe. I'm very worried about ideas of national character and confusions between the people and their leaders. So I would plead for us not to use the concept of Russia in some sort of as the basis of a new ism, because I think that's very dangerous. I mean, Ustashism at least is based on a movement called Ustasha, and even then there's a problem genericizing it and turning it into a more general phenomenon, and which is what happened with Italy's fascism. And I think with care that can be done. I'm even worried about Putinism, because Putin himself has actually gone through a series of changes in policy and even in personality. And I see him as at the extreme now of living out fantasy politics. I mean, he's really, in a way, for me, resembles people like the late Napoleon or whatever, in a way. You know, if we're really trying to get a handle on this, let's look at the psychology of autocrats and how they perpetuate their atrocities by working through other people who are not necessarily ideological believers, but they are part of, look at the corruption around Saddam Hussein or whatever. I just think if we're going to look at him politically, scientifically, or with intelligent journalism as an aim, then we need a much broader brush and broader toolkit of analysis. But I would still come back to the point that I'm worried about the overvaluing of academics and intellectuals in all this. There is an absolute human catastrophe taking place in Ukraine for whatever reasons it is. It's like the earthquake that's just happened in Afghanistan on one level. And really the response should be practical about planning for a post-Putin age, rallying understanding of the deeply humanistic and democratic and human aspect of the Ukrainians, their suffering. I mean, for example, it would be pointless if the genocide of Jews was happening again to get bogged down in definitions of fascism, Nazism, and anti-Semitism, when there are all these extraordinary practical things we have to engage in. So as a way of sharpening our antagonism to Putin, this sort of debate may have a value, but I hope that it does not distract us from some much more concrete issues, which I think should be engaging the intelligentsia of the West.
Yes, thank you very much for clarifying your points on critique of Russism and Putinism, and also for your engaged statement on supporting Ukraine more in practical terms than some academic deliberations. However, this term of fascism or not fascism also, I think, as also Oleksandr implied, has a lot of political, has an impact, and especially and probably in German perceptions of Russia. But I pass over the word to Andreas, who also wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I wanted to actually comment on a remark you made by Marco Bresciani in the chat, who is a scholar of fascism and who has pointed out that the ideology of the Russian regime is anti-revolutionary, and it fears revolution, and therefore the term fascism does not apply here. And I would fully agree. Concerning Russia, indeed, there's no revolution necessary, because the Russian Federation, as it currently is basically fine. With a colleague, Stefan Keilitz, we have actually, against the background of the Weimar Russia discussion of the 1990s, made the somewhat sort of maybe too risky comparison of Putin with Paul von Hindenburg, that in a certain way, Hindenburg was a representative of the old regime. He wanted to restore the old empire. He was not a democrat. On a very abstract level, Putin is more like Hindenburg. And a colleague of mine that Marlene probably knows in Washington, Nicholas Gvozdev, has in a tweet made the comparison of Putin, perhaps, and of Putinism with Franco, and with Francoism. Yeah, so that, and and there's also, there's a discussion actually in comparative fascist studies whether Francoism was a fascist, and most of the people, including myself, have come to the conclusion that Franco's regime was not fascist. But there's a certain discussion here going on. But still, I would argue that for the Russian Federation, no revolution is necessary. But for Ukraine, you need a revolution. You need a new regime. You need a new culture. You need a new foreign policy. You need a new educational system. And the paradox is here that until 2014, Ukraine was actually pretty Russianized, and it was a lot of Russian being used in the mass media. And only in reaction to the annexation of Crimea and the pseudo-civil war in the Donbass, then the new cultural policies, the sort of nationalizing policies as described by Brubaker, for instance, appear with the new education law, a new language law, the separation of the church, the memory laws, and so on. And this is all in reaction only to this attack from 2014. Now we have, of course, the anti-Russian. So from the anti-communist and nationalizing policies, we have now actually anti-Russian policies. But the odd thing here is that what Ukraine is currently doing, it's sort of renaming streets and places and locations in Ukraine that until recently were named after Russians. So there was until recently a Pushkin Street in Kiev, a Moskovskaya Street, a Moscow Street in Kiev, a Tolstoy Square in Kiev, although, you know, Pushkin and Tolstoy have no special relation to Kiev. So and that only happened after 24th of February, yeah. But already before this sort of the non-Russian development of Ukraine was seen as anti-Russian, and you know, and this sort of pathological view of Ukraine as by being non-Russian and being anti-communist, as being you know, as simply being Ukrainian, as being anti-Russian. This is something that, you know, that is already pretty pathological. That is not any longer some sort of, you know, Hindenburg or, you know, restoring the empire, going back to the good old times, you know, the sort of nostalgia, reactionary policies. This is already something that has a new quality. And, you know, I would actually argue that then why not use the term that that is there.
Yes, thank you very much for the statements and your contributions to the discussion. We have now a very large number of comments in the chat. I think that we should also try to take up in a way. We can, not all are questions, and we can probably not address all questions, but I think we should try to address some of them.
It's a lot.
Yeah. I think I would like to start with this question. I think I will look through it from the top. I think I will maybe start with this question by Dnipro Bondarenko. The contemporary Russian regime can be considered as a quasi-fascist or even a symbiosis of Bolshevism, Leninism, Stalinism, and Nazism. Maybe you can also a little bit reframe this question also in a perspective that also for me was quite striking when I realized a little bit a striking contradiction between the public debate and what, at least in my view, one could observe in developments in the Russian regime and the debates. I think there is a strong Soviet element in it. What is Russia currently doing, and how Russia is developing also internally, and also the idea is also in a way to. Not though that is also there, but it's also I think the real idea there is the Soviet Union, the restoration of the Soviet Union in a way, not totally not in a total way with respect to the internal order, but in a territorial sense. And what in Russia develops currently also goes in a way in that direction. I think that is maybe a question we could also address, or I would be interesting to hear your comments on that.
Well, can I just say, I mean, I think after the Ukrainian war, which must end eventually, and when there is a certain amount of stability, it'll be very interesting to see how academics and people far more specialized than I am about Russian affairs look at the genesis of what happened. And I'm fascinated by the idea that there is a sort of a mixture going on in the DNA of what's happening between the Bolshevik regime, between a very ancient idea of Russia as an empire which is not fully part of the West and not fully part, a sort of buffer between the sort of real barbaric East and this West that Russia has never really felt fully part of or wanted to be fully part of. I think of the intellectuals of the 19th century who had a very deep love-hate relationship with the West. And if you look at the Russian nihilists, etc., I think there will be time to look at the genesis of what's going on now. But I think the most important issue at present is that, even though it's ultimately probably limited in how far you can go, is to be able to work out after Putin, after this war, where Russia will be going from there. The legacy of Putin, it depends on how it ends, it depends where it is. But I as an outsider, what I would like to know, maybe somebody can help me today, is how far Putin's foreign policy, if it is a policy, is rooted in a circle around him and deep into ruling oligarchs, not the financial oligarchs, but the ruling elites of Russia, or how far this is a very idiosyncratic piece of personal dictatorship, which is artificially being kept up by a small circle, but is actually unrepresentative of a lot of far more intelligent and, if you like, humanistic thinking and policy making, which is potentially there when he goes. I mean, are we really dealing with a Putinized Russia, or is this actually a horrific aberration? And Russia will revert to some form of experiment with liberal democracy when all this is over. And that for me is a far more burning question as for academics and specialists to address than whether what we're seeing is fascist or not.
Я би теж трохи прокоментував сказане. Справді ми не можемо накреслити якусь одну лінію генеалогії сучасного рашизму. Тому що тут ми можемо простежити і впливи російської імперської ідеології, я маю на увазі дореволюційну Росію, і впливи більшовизму, не стільки ленінізму, як сталінізму, і впливи фашизму і навіть нацизму. Тобто це такий симбіоз різних ідеологій, які так чи інакше вплинули на те, що часом називають рашизмом. І я хотів би відреагувати на побоювання Роджера Грифіна стосовно терміну рашизм, який має виразні антиросійські конотації і нібито може викликати якесь негативне ставлення до російського народу. Це не обов'язково так. Я нагадаю добре відомий факт, що Ференц Салаші називав свою ідеологію хунгаризмом, що існував францизм і французький рух, але з цього ніяк не випливає, що угорці чи французи мали якусь особливу схильність до фашизму, тоталітаризму чи подібних речей. Тобто, якщо ми вирішимо...
Can I say, I totally take that, but when the word Islamofascism was created, the people who created it were referring to Islamism and to, but it very quickly got picked up with connotations that Islam was somehow fascist. And I'm worried about a sort of creep from a very specific term, a Russian version of fascism, to the idea that there's a sort of Russianism and that there's a thing called Russia and Russian society and some Russian national character, etc. And that really worries me, because I do think that the EU handled the transition, the democratic transition of Ukraine very badly, personally. That's my uninformed opinion. And that there was a great insensitivity to how certain events which looked very natural and rational in the West could be misperceived by people who were recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example. And all I'm worried about is that Putin comes to embody something about Russia rather than something extremely specific and idiosyncratic. And what I was saying earlier is that I'm not in a position to understand how typical or atypical Putin is. I know he's playing with very deep traumas and traditions within the Russian self-image, if you can talk about that. But I'm just hoping that he is in many ways atypical of something which is much more, if you like, civilized and humanistic, and I'm not even going to say Western, just human, which exists latently and has been suppressed and oppressed in Russia, just as it was under Nazism. I mean, one of the most extraordinary phenomena for me in post-war history was the speed with which this totally Nazified country that had been under Nazi propaganda for 12 years and had been through the most incredible traumatic destruction of its cities, etc., adopted and absorbed liberal democracy. And I just want to keep away from stereotyping and prejudicing through the way we construct our debates. That's all I'm saying.
Я в жодному разі не наполягаю на використанні саме терміну рашизм. Це термін доволі випадковий, ми можемо придумати інший. Але йдеться про те, що ця ось сучасна фаза того, що я називаю російським імперським націоналізмом, потребує якогось окреслення, в тому числі термінологічного. І у всякому разі, який термін би ми не прийняли, ми не повинні стверджувати, що це відображає якусь російську душу чи особливості російського національного характеру.
Yeah.
Так, сьогодні...
But let's be careful. Once you put an ism on something...
I think we should stop. We have a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
Путінізм, так. Путінізм, так. Але путінізм – це лише частина явища, яке є набагато ширше. І який би термін ми не прийняли, так, сьогодні більшість росіян підтримує війну і підтримує Путіна. Це показують вірогідні соціологічні опитування. І з цього багато навіть моїх колег роблять висновок, що в Росії демократія неможлива у принципі, і в Росії якісь те, що ми називаємо європейськими цінностями, ніколи не прищепиться. Я так не думаю. Я вважаю, що не буває безнадійних націй. І навіть історія Росії показує, що ліберальні і демократичні реформи в ній не раз починалися. Правда, щоразу ми бачили відкат назад. Ми бачили реакцію. Але я ще раз наголошую на тому, що всі реформи і революції в Росії починалися після програних війн. І демократизація, справжня демократизація Росії і позбування оцих фашистських чи квазіфашистських рис можливе лише після повної ліквідації путінського режиму.
Yes, Marlene has a comment, and I think there's all, maybe you can address that also.
Yeah, I wanted to...
Limiting the question that fascism is nothing, the accusation of fascism is nothing that someone alienates Russia from Europe, but rather emphasizes that it is a part of Russia. The question by Thomas Lindenberger. Yes.
Yeah, well, fascism is part of European history, so saying that Russia is fascist shouldn't be considering it as kind of othering it, because it's part of our own societies. And I think we are seeing that Western liberal democracy is not obvious, including in the West. So for me, all that needs to be relativized. But I wanted to go back on the discussion about, like, is that all about kind of Putin himself, and is there something for the regime? For me, it's both, right? I think clearly there have been something that has been specifically happening around Putin himself, and I think the way we have seen that the Russian elites were not prepared for the war, were not told the war were arriving, and we had this kind of panic moment, even at a very high governmental level, when it became clear between February 21st and 24 that it was there. And I'm thinking about the Security Council meeting and so on. I think it's telling us that it has been the decision of one man and a small circle around him, but that many of the Russian elites were not prepared and were not favoring that kind of solution. That said, I think here also you have also long-term structural systemic issue that there have been, and that I think is a generally shared feeling among the Russian elites, that Ukraine is largely not legitimized, maybe not in being totally destroyed as a nation state, but that it should be under Russian influence. That I think is largely shared. So Putin or not Putin, we may not have the war, but we will still have to work with that. And that I think is something that takes decades to deconstruct. And for me, that's belongs to the kind of colonial imperial tradition and not to the fascist one. So I think we have both kind of long-term vision of that will stay even once Putin himself will not be there anymore, and that will still be difficult for many of the Russian elites to agree to this kind of loss of the empire, and especially of Ukraine, because Ukraine is core the national identity. And then there was things that were specific to Putin himself in making the decision to invade. I think one key element of the discussion that we had also in some of the question and Marco's comment is that if the regeneration is happening to Ukrainians, but Ukrainians are part of Russian, then do we consider that the regeneration narrative applied, and in that case, it's kind of playing in favor of the definition of fascism? I think here we have a really interesting discussion that is very specific, because it's really about the way Russia is constructing Ukrainians as internals, right? And so one of the comparisons I was making at the beginning with China's policy of cultural and potentially physical genocide against Uyghurs, here also it's not exactly the same, because in the Chinese vision, the Uyghurs are more internal others, while in the Russian visions, Ukrainians are internal inners and not others. So I think there are a lot of kind of interesting elements to have discussed that were very visible in the discussion and in what Andreas has been adding. But for me, the importance of looking at the kind of the colonial or the imperial aspect of Russia's perception of Ukraine is bringing much more to the table of discussion than the fascism one, even if it's not the only element. And I think it's sending us back to what Roger was saying about kind of methodological pluralism.
Yes, Andreas, please.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Roger's remark about Russism. I'm also, you know, I fear here a certain stigmatization, and I usually, when I'm in these discussions, I usually refer to the German past, and that, you know, we've managed to overcome that. But I think the term Ruscism here, I mean, the origins are actually in Ukraine, and the article by Snyder was actually a description of how the Ukrainians came up with this term. It was not a creation of this term, and it was a sort of a reaction to this idea of a Russian world, to the annexation of Crimea, to the and it has become especially popular now in the last 4 months. This term, and so it's not something that stigmatizes Russia as such or initially, but it's rather a reaction. And it's also, I think, a reaction to the fact that, you know, most Ukrainians, to one degree or another, are aware of the internal Russian discourse, of what is said in Russian mass media, in Russian social media. And the picture is not very, very, very nice there. We know for sure that the annexation of Crimea was incredibly popular in Russia. There was even a perception that during the annexation or after the annexation in Russia, that corruption has gone down in Russia, because people were sort of drunk by from the annexation, and they, you know, and the grass was greener. You know, the world was better when this annexation of Crimea happened. Now the official opinion, or the opinion polls that we do have also indicate not as broad support as for the annexation of Crimea, but rather broad support, certainly over 50%. But now you know, there are doubts about how much this support really. These polls are really reflecting the support. But I think the origins of the term Russism, they are exactly from the Ukrainian perception that this is not Putinism. It's not just Putin. You know, it's a broader strain in Russian popular culture, and there's no mobilization with the Z sign, or there's not the same sort of grassroots mobilization as there was in 2014, when actually there were volunteers going to the Donbass to fight, and now you have to pay them actually the people rather good salaries to get them to the to fight. But still, there seems to be quite a lot of support, public support, reflected in the mass media and social media, and and then there is this negation of basically of Ukrainian culture, identity, independence, and so on that comes along. And then Russism is a reaction to this sort of negation of the Ukrainian nation, you could argue.
Yes, I think. Thank you very much. I try to try to look to the chat. In the meantime, there are a lot of comments on different aspects, not always question. Maybe we can address one point that came up in several of the questions or comments. That is the name of Oleksandr Dugin and these question of this more radical nationalist fascist ideologies in Russia, and how we can consider their actual impact on contemporary Russian politics. Is that something that is influencing Putin, or is that something different? Yeah, maybe Marlene.
Yeah, well, I think many of us have worked on this question, so I can briefly summarize my interpretation is that Dugin has been largely emphasized in Western literature, and that it doesn't make sense to look for one intellectual source to understand the regime. There is a plurality of sources, and even more importantly, maybe the point is not to have intellectual sources like identifying thinker. The point is that you have narratives that are spread all over all aspects of popular culture, textbook, movies, media, and that's what informed and created the ideological background. So trying to identify some people, so either it's Dugin, either it's Ilyin, I think it's a misunderstanding on how this kind of worldview, like really vision of the world and interpretation of the world, is built in a much more consensual and grassroots or bottom-up aspect by a lot of other kind of media or production of knowledge and of interpretation. And I think we know more or less how, or we know partly how these kind of circles of influence work around Putin, and Dugin is really not part of that. And even Snyder's, I think, has been really too much insisting on Ilyin as a key figure. Is a key figure for some groups. I don't think he's such a key figure for Putin. I don't think Putin is reading philosophy. Putin is reading memoir by Russian state actors, and I think on that he's a much more doer than a thinker, and therefore he's reading other doer, like he has been reading Kerensky, for example. So Kerensky is probably more directly influential on Putin's minds than Ilyin. I think there are a lot here in kind of in deconstructing and realizing that there is no one guilty figure to look at, but it's a much more broader kind of cultural phenomenon that has been created over the years. Andreas, you did a lot on that too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and we don't know of any meeting between Dugin and Putin. I think they, at least it has not been reported that they ever actually met, and even, you know, so the connections are very indirect, if there are any. Yeah, I mean, in the 1990s, I think Dugin, as others, have played a role in sort of shaping this sort of alternative narrative, you know, and as you, Marlene, have described, and others, you know, he had this sort of intermediate role in that he translated many of the Western authors, and actually he's by himself. I don't know how you think about him, not particularly original. What is original is his sort of translating of these Western ideas for the Russian public, and the sort of terminological congruence that one can see here, let's say, between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Eurasianism of Dugin is actually misleading. I think the Eurasianisms that Putin and Dugin have in mind are actually very different. You know, for Putin, this is a much less ideologically loaded term. It's largely a geographical term that is sort of neutral, and so I don't think he is a follower of Duginist neo-Eurasianism. but I think that there needs to be perhaps be done more research on, how did we get where we are now? Does it come out of a sort of KGB tradition? Was it always there and basically hidden by Putin, let's say, when he was working for Sobchak, and then they had this, seems to be the argument in a way of Catherine Belton, that you had basically this sort of circle of people who had already all this basically in their minds when in the 1990s, when they had lost the power, and then they sort of came back and then they implemented that, or whether they actually evolved under the influence of a number of authors, and then Dugin would be one of them. And often it's been said that his book Osnovy Geopolitiki, Foundations of Geopolitics, is used in the military academies, and that you had this sort of larger literature, and then the influence of the conservative revolution and the French New Right and so on, and traditionalism and whatnot. I'm not sure whether one needed, these people actually needed people like Dugin, Prokhanov, and all the many others, and Gumilov and Ilyin. Maybe that was already in the sort of KGB mindset where they came out of, and you didn't need actually that much intellectual fodder to get into this sort of situation we are now in. But I'm not sure, or maybe it's both. I think that there's still research, meaningful research to be done in this direction.
Yes, I think that would be a good concluding remark to outline the tasks for the future. But nevertheless, I would like to ask if one of the other panelists has would like to make a final comment, or if we... Yes, if not, if everyone is happy, I thank you very all.
I have a final comment, if you please.
Yeah.
Просто я не хотів говорити першим, але якщо немає більше ніхто коментарів, то я скажу кілька слів.
Andreas was the first one.
Добре. Ну, я скажу, а потім Андреас. На мій погляд, війну проти України розв'язав не Путін. Принаймні, не тільки він. Її розв'язав і веде російський імперський націоналізм. І те, що називають расизмом, є, по суті, останньою фазою розвитку цього російського імперського націоналізму. Чи ми будемо вживати термін фашизм, расизм, чи якийсь інший термін. І я думаю, тут говорилося про те, що термін фашизм використовується для того, щоб відчужити Росію від Європи, виключити з Росії з Європи. Я сказав би інакше, російський режим сам виключив себе з Європи своєю агресивною політикою. І тут дебати про фашизм не мають ніякого відношення. І остаточне розв'язання тієї світової кризи, яку ми зараз спостерігаємо, не може бути досягнуто шляхом якихось компромісів з путінським режимом. Це може бути лише тимчасовий компроміс. Остаточне розв'язання може бути пов'язане лише з крахом путінського режиму і крахом расизму, як цієї останньої фази російського імперського націоналізму. Тільки тоді демократичний розвиток Росії може бути можливий, і тільки тоді можливе може бути існування України і інших сусідів Росії як незалежних держав, які самі обирають шлях свого розвитку. Це те, що я хотів сказати.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, Roger also wanted to say something. You have to unmute yourself, I think.
I totally endorse what Oleksandr has just been saying, and I hope I live long enough to have a Zoom conference with Russian humanistic intellectuals that are part of the genuine democratic regeneration of Russia, because ultimately this present type of politics in Russia is unsustainable on all sorts of levels. And so I'm just hoping that my residue of hippie optimism from the 60s will be justified, and that the academic community could be very important in reintegrating elements of Russian society at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Yes, Marlene, do you like to add something?
No, I like finishing on Roger's comments.
Yeah, okay. Yes, so thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting and important discussion. I think we touched very important points. Clearly, this is not a discussion that is not finished and will continue also for a longer time, also clearly depending on how this war and the Russian regime will continue and will exist or not exist. But this it's clearly a fundamental historic caesura, and the meaning of that will be certainly a subject of debate, research, and discussion for the next decades. Yes, I thank you very much for your participation. Also, the audience for the many comments in the chats. And I would like to close with the announcement of our next seminar that will take on the 14th of July, and the speaker then will be Professor Larry Wolff from New York University, and a central subject of this talk will be his most recent book on Woodrow Wilson, The Principle of National Self-Determination in the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War. Yes, thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Дякую.
Thank you very much. That was very stimulating. Bye-bye.